On this video, I'm giving this 2024 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon 392 a full suspension upgrade to help clear these massive 38-inch tall tires. On the last installment of this build, I mounted these 38 by 1350 R17 Nitto Trail Grapplers onto a set of 17 by 9 KMC tank beadlock wheels. I then proceeded to mount them under the Jeep without modifying the suspension. Yes, the 392 does come from the factory with a 2-inch lift, so it wasn't necessarily no lift in 38s, but putting these tires on here was no easy feat. While I was able to get away with this configuration on road, the additional bump stops that it required cut into the ride quality, and despite the fact that it did have 4.4 inches of back spacing, I was still dealing with tire contact off-road, so yes, it needed a lift. Now the suspension I'm going to be installing today is a 3.5-inch Stage 4 Overland from EVO Manufacturing. It does have a few options, and I want to dive into that before we get under the vehicle. Opting for Stage 4, what that means is you're getting all new control arms for your Jeep. Now the advantages of the new control arms are actually quite few and quite important. Number one, you're going to get a stronger set of control arms. These are DOM tubing arms, and they're going to be able to take impacts off-road much more easily than the factory control arm. So you're getting a strength upgrade. Even better is these things are adjustable. That's going to allow you to fine-tune the placement of the axle. As you lift the Jeep, the suspension has a tendency to sort of come into the body. This is going to allow you to push the axles out where they need to be. For the rear, you're going to be able to adjust the pinion correctly so you don't have to worry about driveline issues. And in the front, you can dial in the caster, which is going to make it drive better. Now, the last thing that these control arms have that's absolutely worth mentioning is all of the arms come standard with Johnny joints, and these joints are going to allow the suspension to articulate much more easily than the factory rubber bushings. And what I really like about them is when you have 35 degrees of misalignment with this Johnny joint, it allows the suspension to sort of move very smoothly and easily off-road. So it's going to take out a lot of that head toss and awkward movement and sway that you typically get out of a more aggressive rubber bushing. The only downside of a Johnny joint is that it does not absorb vibration as much as a typical rubber bushing. So it's a little bit of a trade-off as you're getting more off-road performance, which is really what this kit is intended for, versus vibration absorption, but it still does a pretty good job of that. Now, as I mentioned, these things are adjustable, and one of the things that comes with this kit that actually helps it make it drive a little bit better is the control arm drop brackets. This is what EVO considers their overland part of it. Now, the good thing about a set of control arm drop brackets is it's going to allow that control arm angle to reduce. So whenever you lift the Jeep, you're basically, ideally you want the control arm to be as flat as possible. And as you raise the vehicle, the axle is essentially going to go down, the Jeep goes up, and you create a steeper angle. And the worse this angle gets, the worse it is not only for suspension handling, but it really impacts how the Jeep drives and how it takes bumps. The advantages of going with a control arm drop is that you're going to take this point here and bring it down so you reduce the angle of the control arm. What you want ideally is a control arm to be as close to flat as possible. So when you're going over an obstacle, it's easy for it to sort of go up and over. When you get too much of a control arm angle and you go at an obstacle, the Jeep will actually have a tendency to lift and it'll push the arm back. So this is going to help with that. This is also really going to help with handling. Not only will we be able to get the caster right, but it's going to drive a little bit better with the geometry closer to how it was intended from the factory. The first thing that I like to do is take initial measurements. That way I've got a good idea of how much actual lift I got. I like to start with the rear of the Jeep because I feel like it's a little bit faster. The first thing you want to do is go ahead and unplug your locker harness. That way you don't have to worry about overextending that and breaking that at the axle. Now, once you unhook the locker, it is recommended to reroute your parking brake cables under the rear crossmember. To do this, I use a set of vice grips to relieve the tension and slide the hook out of the bracket. After that, I'll use a 13mm to slide over the cable, and that releases the line from the bracket. At this point, you can reroute them over the crossmember, and I left mine bolted in. Some people like to unbolt them and actually route them under the fuel line hoses. I've done that in the past. With this kit, I knew that you didn't have to do that, so I feel like this is a bit neater, so I kept them in place that way. To reinstall the cables, I like to attach them back at the axle, and then I'll use a ratchet strap to help pull the cable while I guide it back into the bracket. You could also unbolt the center console and loosen the cable tension there. I just find this to be faster. Your next step is to remove your factory bump stops. I had these aftermarket ones in there because I was running these 38s. If you have a Extreme Recon package on your 392, you'll have a 1-inch bump stop in the back, or if it's a 24 and newer like this, it'll also come with a 1-inch bump stop. At this point, you can go ahead and pull the rear sway bars, but keep these around as you will be reusing these in the front of the Jeep. From there, I went ahead and pulled the rear track bar, keeping in mind that you are going to be reusing the hardware, but since I got the optional track bar, was not going to be reusing that. Now at this point, I like to go ahead and loosen all 4 control arms so the axle can move a little bit more easily. Then with the axle supported, I will unbolt the lower shock bolts. This is an 18mm. Once those are removed, you can slowly start dropping the rear axle and pull the stock coils. Be mindful that these have coil isolators that sit at the top that you will be reusing. Once I removed the coils, I could start replacing the control arms. I like to do this one set at a time, so I start with the uppers. I set those to 17 5/8, and then I moved to the lowers, which I adjusted to 20 1/8 of an inch. I now turn my attention to the coils. These are not side specific. You'll just need to make sure that you align the rubber isolators correctly. I like to use a paint marker to make a line on the isolator so I know where it's supposed to be. While there is a small rubber grommet that pokes out the top of the bucket, when you are installing the coils by yourself, it's hard to make sure that that's in the correct location. The mark on the isolator will make this much easier, and you can take your time with the floor jack to make sure that the coils are where they need to be. With them under a little bit of tension, you can go ahead and install the shocks. We opted for the EVO Spec King 2.5 remote reservoir series that are designed for 3 to 5 inch lifts. Now, as I mentioned, we did get the optional adjustable track bar. Don't worry too much about getting the alignment perfect at this step, as you will need to measure the Jeep sitting on tires to ensure it's even from side to side. Just for reference, I started with the bar at 34 1/4 inches. Next up were the new sway bar links. You'll need to pop in the polyurethane bushings and sleeves to get these ready. EVO includes all of the necessary hardware. For these, I recommend waiting until the Jeep is sitting under its own weight before tightening them down. From here, I moved to the bump stop mounts. Now these bolt directly to the axle and they provide 2.5 inches of bump. That should be plenty to keep this 38 out of the back of the flare. After putting the Jeep back on tires, I tightened down the sway bar links, then the shocks. Before tightening the control arms, I needed to check how the pinion was aligning with the drive shaft. You want the pinion to be in line with the drive line if you are running a stock drive line. Happy with the driveline angle, I was able to go ahead and tighten the hardware for the control arms and the jam nuts. Now I was ready to check the tracking. I do this by measuring from the outside of the fender to the outside of the tire. I had to adjust the bar a few turns to get the tracking correct. A ratchet strap will make this process a bit easier if you're doing it by yourself. Once I got everything to read evenly, I tightened the track bar and paint marked all of the rear hardware after everything was torqued to spec. Now when it comes to lifting the front, I prefer using 2 floor jacks, but you can get the job done with 1 if that's all you have. This isn't my first time lifting a JAL or a 392, and one thing that I have learned is that most suspension kits on the market will require you to pull this stock crossmember if you are retaining the factory driveline. If not, it may hit and destroy the boot on the drive shaft, or worse, bend the drive shaft. Now here is also where I should have showed you how I disconnected the front drive shaft at the axle. I didn't, and I should have, and I'll go into more why later, but for those doing this at home and following this along, be sure to go ahead and unbolt it at the axle and just hang it out of the way. With the axle hanging, you can go ahead and remove and discard the front sway bar links as they will not be reused, and go ahead and take off the stock front track bar. Another tip I have learned over time with installing kits on the Gladiator and JL is how to remove the brake line guides that attaches to the control arm. I like to use a Dremel with a cutoff wheel to slowly and carefully make a cut down the middle of the bracket. I'll then take a pair of vice grips and bend the bracket to release the hose. I'm aware that there are other methods and approaches to get this job done. This is just how I like to do it. Speaking of brake lines, EVO does provide brake line drop brackets which attach to the frame using the factory bolt along with the provided hardware. Like the rear, you want to ensure that your locker plug is unplugged, and go ahead and unhook your vent hose from the differential. Using a 10mm, remove the heat shields that cover the upper control arms, and then loosen the uppers but not remove them. You'll use a 18mm for the upper control arms and a 21mm socket and 24mm wrench for the lower arms. Next, using a floor jack to support the axle, unbolt the lower shock bolts and slowly lower the axle until the coils unseat and you can remove them. Next, remove the stock front shocks using an 18mm. If you want to make a little bit more room for your tools in your hand, it is helpful to remove 3 10mm bolts that keep the inner fender liner in place and allow you to peel it back just a little bit more. Making sure that the axle is not under tension, I went ahead and pulled the arms on the driver's side and installed the first geometry correction bracket. Some companies make these as a multi-piece bracket. I genuinely prefer this one-piece design. I find it much easier to install, especially if you're doing it by yourself. It is also helpful to have something to align the lower bolt hole once you get the upper bolt in. Don't tighten anything down until you got both of your bolts in. Once they are lined up, you can go ahead and actually cinch this thing down because you're not going to need to be removing it. You will repeat these same steps on the passenger side. The only thing that's worth noting is that on the 392, the upper control arm bolt does contact the exhaust slightly, making it a little bit more difficult to install and remove the bolt, but I didn't have to cut anything to do it. Be mindful at this point that the only thing keeping your axle in place is really your Jeep's drag link, so really be cautious as you're doing this. Once the drop brackets were bolted in, I started by installing the upper control arms. I set the uppers to 20.5 inches from eyelet to eyelet, and using 2 floor jacks, I was able to position the axle where I needed it to and have that second jack to adjust the pinion to twist it a bit to make it a little bit easier to line up the hardware. With the uppers in place, I adjusted the lowers to 24.5 inches and installed both of those. Up next were the shock reservoir mounting brackets. You'll assemble these off of the Jeep and then bolt them to the frame using the stock brake line bracket hold down and the provided frame insert that goes just behind the coil bucket. Once these are installed, you can place in the shock, making sure to slide the fluid reservoir through the mount as you install it. The upper shock bolt can be a little difficult to line up, and this is partly due to you having to squeeze your hand behind the inner fender. If you want to pull the inner fender off and make life a little bit easier, be my guest. It's just an extra step that I've learned I can get away from having to do. I'm sure I'm going to get this question, so I'll go ahead and address it now. No, I'm not swapping out the front drive shaft. That being said, I should have unbolted the drive shaft before I drooped out the suspension. I just totally forgot. And I've done this before in the past, embarrassingly enough. And what happens when you don't unbolt it is, if you see right there, you'll end up overextending it here and you'll kind of dent this little cage. Now, I've done this in the past and it hasn't been a problem, but maybe this time it's going to be a problem. So I'm going to have to keep an eye on that and find out if I just messed something up and if I'll have to get a new front drive shaft. Now, the only reason that it's a benefit to keep this factory front drive shaft is on the 392, let's go over here, there's a block off plate instead of a fad. Now, that's seemingly an advantage, but the problem is your drive shaft's always going to spin. And if you put this thing at 6 degrees of caster and you have an aftermarket drive line, you might get into front drive shaft vibration. So we'll see. EVO says you can run it, so I'm going to test that out. I do have the shocks hooked up right now. One of the things I like to do is just let the suspension kind of hang with the shocks being the limiting strap right now, and make sure that, you know, all of my lines and things like that have plenty of room. I'll hop out and we'll take a look at the you know, locker and vent hose and things like that too. Now you definitely want to make sure, if you have a Rubicon, that the plug is going to be able to fit without, you know, overstretching or anything like that. This was really tight, so I had to, there's like one clip back here I popped out, and so you can actually see it right there. So this gave me a little bit more room. The breather I pulled out from that little clip, I just cut that off, and it'll have enough room now to actually make it on there. It is still pretty tight, but this is full droop, so it should be fine. So the next thing is I'm going to cycle the suspension and make sure that the landing pad and the bump is hitting where it should. So when this thing goes complete up travel, this is hitting properly. Part of this is going to be, you know, the control arms need to be final adjusted, but they're pretty close right now, or at least I hope they are. So we'll see. Take 2 jack stands, that's how I do it, or 4 jacks, excuse me. Put them each on the control arm and just guide it up so at full bump you can see where this is going. After I cycled the suspension, I unbolted the bottom of the shocks and removed the bump stop so I can install the coil springs. These are a little easier to do than in the rear, but you will need to keep an eye on those upper isolators to make sure that both of the isolator guides are poking through the top coil bucket. Don't forget as well to make sure that you have the bump stop in the coil as you are installing the new coil springs. These are not side specific. With the bump stops and shocks bolted in place, I installed the provided sway bar sleeves into the factory front sway bar. Then took the sway bars that I moved from out back and bolted them up front. As is the case in the rear, this does have the optional adjustable front track bar, which uses the same type of pinch bolt design in lieu of a jam nut. I started the track bar at a touch over 34 inches just to kind of get it close. I knew that I would need to adjust it once I got it on the wheels. With the Jeep sitting on the weight, I wanted to do 2 important things. Number 1, I wanted to check the caster. So these Jeeps drive really well with around 6 degrees of positive caster. So I used a digital angle finder at the base of the seat to see how much caster I had, and I was pretty close to that 6 degrees. So I was very happy with that. Once that looked good, I bolted down the control arms, torqued them to spec, and got the jam nuts as tight as I could. At this point, I could get to dialing in the tracking. A quick tip in regards to adjusting the tracking on the vehicle. If I had someone else here, it'd be very easy to get them to be in the vehicle, turn the wheel, and that's going to move the body enough so I can line up the track bar and just drop the bolt in fairly easily. Since I'm by myself, I'm going to use a ratchet strap to get the vehicle lined up so I can slide the bolt in and then recheck the tracking. Once I got that looking good, I could turn my attention to the drag link. From here, you'll just need a 15 millimeter, and this is going to allow you to adjust your steering wheel. I wasn't too worried about getting the wheel perfect, as I had already had an appointment with my local off-road shop, Low Range 4x4, to get the Jeep on the alignment machine post-lift. Thankfully, the numbers looked great, and the only thing that they ended up adjusting was the toe and fine-tuning the steering wheel placement. In terms of the actual lift this suspension provided it over stock, I found that the front was raised by 2¼ inches and in the rear by 1¾ inch, and I think it looks like a great balance with the 38-inch tall Nitto trail grapplers. From the bottom of the frame rail to the ground, there is now 19½ inches of ground clearance, which I'm excited to see how much improvement that's going to make on the trail. Also, the front drive shaft seems to be fine as of now. There's no slinging grease or any issues to report. The next stop for this Jeep will definitely be the dirt. So if you are digging this build, be sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date on the latest videos. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the trail.